Get Headspace wrong, and a normal primary fermentation can turn into a clogged airlock, a leaking lid, a bucket pushing foam, or a batch that seems fine at first and creates issues later. And that is exactly why this topic trips people up. If you make mead, wine, or beer, too little headspace is usually the first danger in primary. But there's a point where extra headspace starts working against you. And if you don't understand where that line is, you can make the right batch in the wrong vessel without realizing it. This video is about primary fermentation only. That matters because once fermentation slows down and you move into conditioning, aging, or what many people call secondary, the rules change. That is the one reason headspace advice sounds so confusing. A lot of people are talking about different stages and acting like they are the same thing. So let's make it plain. Headspace is the empty space between the surface of your must or wort and the top of the fermenter. It sounds minor. It is not. That space is where foam rises, where gas builds and escapes, and where a lot of problems either get prevented early or being created by accident. And that one is the one that shows up fast. Too little headspace. Once fermentation starts, moving yeast begins chewing through sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. And that gas does not leave gently. It pushes foam, yeast, proteins, pulp, spices, grain debris, hop material, and other solids upward. In beer, that foam is usually called krausen. In fruit-heavy ferments, melomels, country wines, or anything with skins and pulp, you can get more of a cap. Different name, same problem. The top of the fermenter fills up fast. And when there's not enough room, the foam and pressure do not just vanish. They force their way out. That is when airlocks get packed with junk, lids start leaking, buckets burp foam, and a mess ends up outside the fermenter instead of inside it. And that is not just annoying cleanup. It can cost you product, create sanitation headache, and in a sealed setup, it can create pressure problems you do not want. That's why primary fermentation needs breathing room. Not because empty headspace has some magic property, because active fermentation can get violent. And this matters more than a lot of beginners think, because appearances can fool you. A traditional mead made with honey, water, and yeast can look calmer at first than a lot of beers and fruit ferments. That calm surface tricks people. They look at the batch, think it is behaving, and fill the vessel like nothing dramatic is coming. Then day 2 or 3 hits. A beer may look predictable until a healthy yeast pitch, a warmer fermentation, or a more aggressive strain makes krausen surge hard. High gravity must or high gravity wort, certain yeast strains, warm fermentation, nutrient additions can make fermentation surge hard. Sometimes it looks slow and then suddenly takes off. Sometimes it seems quiet till the nutrient schedule kicks it into another gear in mead. Sometimes a beer fermentation climbs harder than expected because of temperature, yeast behavior, or the way proteins and hop material build krausen. Sometimes fruit in a melomel makes the cap climb much higher than a beginner expects. So headspace is not just about what the liquid looks like on day 1. It's about what the fermentation can become on day 2 or 3. And that is where people want a clean rule. How much headspace do you need? The honest answer is that there is no perfect one-size-fits-all number. There is a standard fermenter size a lot of people use, but it's not a guarantee. It depends on batch size, fermenter shape, gravity, temperature, yeast strain, fruit load, solids in suspension, and how aggressive the fermentation is. Still, there's a reason homebrewers so often put a 5-gallon batch in a roughly 6.5-gallon primary fermenter. It gives krausen room to rise. It gives gas and foam room to move. And it gives you a buffer before you end up cleaning your sealing. So if you're unsure, more room in primary is usually safer than less. That does not mean unlimited headspace is ideal. It means running out of room early is often the fastest way to cause trouble. Now here's where people get twisted up. They hear that too much headspace is dangerous, and then they jump to the idea that any extra room in primary will ruin the batch. That's too simple. During active primary fermentation, yeast is producing a lot of carbon dioxide. That gas helps push air out of the fermenter through the airlock. So, in a normal primary fermentation, extra room above the liquid is often not a disaster. A lot of times, it helps because it lowers blowoff risk. That is why many mead makers and brewers ferment smaller batches in larger vessels during primary and do just fine. But this is exactly where the advice starts going off the rails. People take that practical truth and stretch it into a bigger claim. They say you can never have too much headspace because CO2 is heavier than air and forms a perfect protective blanket. That is the part that needs correcting. Yes, carbon dioxide is denser than air. Yes, active fermentation can help purge oxygen out of the headspace. But that does not mean the gases stay forever, separated like oil and water. They diffuse, they mix. Time matters, movement matters, openings matter. And once active fermentation starts slowing down, that easy protection starts fading. So the better way to say it is this. During strong primary fermentation, extra headspace is often acceptable within reason because CO2 production is high in oxygen and is being pushed out. But that does not mean infinite headspace is ideal. And it definitely does not mean the same logic still applies once primary is over. That difference matters a lot, especially in mead, wine, and beer that will spend more time in the fermenter than beginners expect. Starting in a bucket or a larger fermenter for safety during primary is smart. But once active fermentation slows down, the goal changes. Now you're not trying to contain a foam volcano. Now you're not trying to protect flavor, aroma, and stability. That is when too much headspace becomes a much bigger concern. And even though this whole video is about primary, you still need to understand that shift so you do not carry the wrong habit into the next stage. So what really decides on how much headspace you need during primary? Start with fermentation intensity. A low-gravity traditional mead fermented cool with a calm yeast can behave very differently from a warm, high-gravity batch with staggered nutrients. A moderate beer can behave very differently from a higher gravity beer or one fermented warm with a strain that throws a huge krausen. Then look at the vessel shape. A tall, narrow fermenter behaves differently from a short, wide one. That exact same batch can look much more aggressive in one vessel than another. And temperature matters too. Warmer fermentations usually move faster, and faster activity often means more gas movement and more foam pressure. So if you're fermenting warm, do not fill right to the top and hope it works out. That is how beginners learn about blow-off tubes the hard way. And yes, a blow-off tube can save a batch. If you already know a fermentation may get wild, using one is often smarter than trusting a small airlock. That is not fear. That is planning ahead. But here's the deeper reason headspace matters in primary. And this is the point a lot of people miss. Headspace is not just empty room. It is a safety margin. It gives the fermentation room to behave naturally without forcing the vessel to fight it. The yeast can move through its most active phase without immediately plugging the exit path. The foam can rise and fall. The gas can vent. The fermenter could stay cleaner. And your chances of a messy, stressful emergency drop hard. That matters because once people panic during fermentation, they often make things worse. They open the lid too often. They wipe up spills after blow-off. They swap clog airlocks in a rush. They disturb the cap or krausen again and again. And all of that is more likely when the fermenter was too full from the start. So a good headspace decision does more than stop a mess. It lowers the chance of all the other mistakes people make after the fermenter is already under pressure. There's another misunderstanding that needs to go. Some people treat headspace like it's only a contamination issue. It is not only that. It's also a process control issue. If your fermenter is overfilled and you lose foam, yeast, and liquid out the top, you're not just dealing with the cleanup. You may be changing the fermentation environment itself. And even if the batch survives, you made the whole process harder than it needed to be. That is why the smartest move usually is the simplest one. Use a vessel with enough extra capacity for the style you're making. If a batch is likely to foam hard, plan for that before you pitch. If fruit is involved, plan for more expansion. If hop-heavy beer, proteins, or other solids are involved, plan for a stronger krausen. If nutrients are going in stages, remember that fermentation can wake back up and push upward again. If you're trying new yeast, give yourself extra room until you know how it behaves in your setup. That one choice can save cleanup, frustration, and sometimes the batch itself. Now, let's answer the big question directly. Can you have too much headspace in primary? Here's the straight answer. You can have more headspace than you need, and in many normal primary fermentations, it will still work out fine. That is very different from saying headspace never matters. During active primary, extra headspace is usually more forgiving than too little headspace because yeast is generating carbon dioxide and pushing much of the air out of the vessel. So, if the choice is a little too much room or not enough room, a little too much room is usually the safer side in primary. But if you push that idea too far, you start trusting a simplified story that is not fully true. CO2 helps. It does not make you immune. And once fermentation slows down, you need to stop thinking like it's still day 2. That's the trap. So here's the practical rule to remember. During primary, size your fermenter for the mess that might happen, not for the calm surface you see before the yeast wakes up. Leave enough room for krausen, cap growth, and gas movement. Do not be afraid of a reasonable amount of extra headspace during active fermentation, but do not use CO2 is heavier than air as an excuse to ignore oxygen forever. That shortcut is where good batches start drifting into the wrong direction. And this is the key idea that ties the whole thing together. Headspace is not one rule. It's 2 different priorities happening at 2 different times. At the start, headspace is about control. You are managing foam, pressure, and overflow. Later, headspace is about protection. You're managing oxygen, flavor, stability, and long-term quality. Once you separate those 2 stages in your mind, a lot of mead making and brewing advice suddenly stops sounding contradictory. That is why people argue about headspace so much. A lot of the time, they're just talking about different stages of fermentation and do not realize it. One person is warning you about blowoff in primary. Another person is warning you about oxidation during conditioning. Both can be right. They're just talking about different moments. So if you make mead or beer, here's the simplest smart approach. For primary, use enough fermenter volume to safely handle the most active stage. Be extra careful with fruit, higher gravity, warmer temperatures, nutrient-driven fermentations, any batch that looks likely to throw a heavy krausen or cap. Use a blow-off tube when the batch gives you any reason to think it may climb. Then when primary is over, stop treating all that extra room like it is harmless forever. That is where the vessel fit starts to matter more. If this cleared up one of the most confusing fermentation topics out there, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing these lessons with our community. And if you've ever had an airlock clog, a fermenter spray, foam across the room, or a batch that looked fine until headspace caught up with it later, drop it in the comments. These stories teach people fast. The short version is this: too little headspace in primary can cause problems right away. Reasonable headspace during active primary is often fine, but headspace is not meaningless. CO2 is not a perfect forever shield, and the stage of fermentation changes the answer. Get that part right, and you stop guessing. You start fermenting with control. Anyway, for more great videos on mead making, click my playlist over here. Happy mead making.